The sound of a cracking knee isn't particularly pleasant. But it gets worse when you listen up close. The cracking recording, it does for most people. But for me, it actually just makes me excited. Omar Inan, an electrical engineer at Georgia Tech. I actually feel like there's some real information in him that can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehab. Inan's experience with cracking knees goes back to his days as an undergrad at Stanford, where he threw discus. If I had a really hard workout, then the next day, of course, I'd be sore, but I'd also sometimes feel this catching or popping or creaking every now and then in my knee. A few years later, he found himself building tiny microphones at a high-end audio company. So when he got to Georgia Tech and heard the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, wanted better tech for knee injuries, he thought, knee cracking recording, why not strap tiny microphones to people's knees to eavesdrop as their legs bend? What we think it is the cartilage and bone rubbing against each other, the surfaces inside the knee rubbing against each other, during those movements. He and a team of physiologists and engineers built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. And preliminary tests on athletes suggest the squishy sounds. For centuries, boys were top of the class. But these days, that's no longer the case. A new study by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries, examined how 15-year-old boys and girls performed at reading, mathematics, and science. Boys still score somewhat better at maths, and in science the genders are roughly equal. But when it comes to the students who really struggle, the difference is stark. Boys are 50% more likely than girls to fall short of basic standards in all three areas. Researchers show that doing homework set by teachers is linked to better performance in maths, reading, and science. Boys, it appears, spend more of their free time in the virtual world. They are 17% more likely than girls to play collaborative online games than girls every day. They also use the internet more. Third, peer pressure plays a role. A lot of boys decide early on that they are just too cool for school, which means they're more likely to be rowdy in class. Teachers mark them down for this. In anonymous tests, boys perform better. In fact, the gender gap in reading drops by a third when teachers don't know the gender of the pupil they are marking. So what can be done to close this gap? Getting boys to do more homework and cut down on screen time would help. But most of all, abandoning gender stereotypes would benefit all students. Boys in countries with the best schools read much better than girls. And girls in Shanghai excel in mathematics. They outperform boys from anywhere else in the world. Why should we bother studying animal behavior? Well, first and foremost, because we are interested in understanding why animals do what they do. There are lots of other reasons for studying animal behavior. Conservation biologists need to know what animals do if they're going to save them. Are those animals social or solitary? How much space do they need and how many mates do they have? Sometimes you can't predict the outcome of the research. Fernando Notboom started out being interested in how birds know what to sing. Yet his research eventually led to a complete overhaul of the entire field of neurobiology, a totally unanticipated yet utterly monumental effect. And this is the course textbook by John Alcock. The fact that this is in its 9th edition tells you how fast and afield animal behavior is. There are lots of new developments.
I understand your professor has been discussing several eastern woodland Indian tribes in your study of Native American cultures. As you have probably learned, the eastern woodland Indians get their name from the forest-covered areas of the eastern United States where they lived. The earliest woodland cultures date back 9,000 years, but the group we'll focus on dates back only to about 700 AD. We now call these Native Americans the Mississippian culture, because they settled in the Mississippi River Valley. This civilization is known for its flat-topped monuments called temple mounds. They were made of earth and used as temples and official residences. The temple mounds were located in the central square of the city, with the huts of the townspeople built in rows around the plaza. The Mississippian people were city dwellers. But some city residents earned their living as farmers, tending the fields of corn, beans, and squash that surrounded the city. The city's artisans made arrowheads, leather goods, pottery, and jewelry. Traders came from far away to exchange raw materials for these items. In the slides I'm about to show, you will see models of a Mississippian city. Actually, a woman in the class I'm teaching at Sydney at the moment, a career woman, expressed this very nicely. Although she was talking about something else, she was distinguishing expertise from authority. And certainly linguists, because of our training, we do have expertise in certain very narrow areas of language, but we don't have the authority over what to do with that knowledge or what to do with other knowledge that the community produces. I guess for me the bottom line is languages are lost because of the dominance of one people over another. That's not rocket science, it's not hard to work that out. But then what that means is if in working with language revival we continue to hold the authority, we actually haven't done anything towards undoing how languages are lost in the first place, so in a sense the languages are still lost if the authority is still lost.
When Australians engage in debate about educational quality or equity, they often seem to accept that a country cannot achieve both at the same time. Curriculum reforms intended to improve equity often fail to do so because they increase breadth or differentiation in offerings in a way that increases differences in quality. Further, these differences in quality often reflect differences in students' social backgrounds because the new offerings are typically taken up by relatively disadvantaged students who are not served well them. Evidence from New South Wales will be used to illustrate this point. The need to improve the quality of education is well accepted across OECD and other countries as they seek to strengthen their human capital to underpin their modern, knowledge economies. Improved equity is also important for this purpose, since the demand for high-level skills is widespread and the opportunities for the low-skilled are diminishing. Improved equity in education is also important for social cohesion. There are countries in which the education system seems primarily to reproduce existing social arrangements, conferring privilege where it already exists and denying it where it does not. Even in countries where the diagnosis might be less extreme, the capacity of schooling to build social cohesion is often diminished by the way in which schools separate individuals and groups. When we have droughts, the rings were very narrow, and the more extreme the narrower the ring is, we're trying to identify patterns and widen their wings. You can come to think of that as a barcode in the food that you might buy in the store. Trees in an area you have not exactly the same pattern, but a similar pattern of wide and narrow range, just like that barcode. We get to the point where we can just look across samples. Okay, there's 1580 and there's 1735. We know where those difficult years are. We able to look at the records in the rings. And from that reconstruct streamflow much further back than we can just with historical records. In some areas under the best conditions we're the best species, we can have up to 10,000 years record from tree rings. We have maybe 5,200 years historical records from the rivers around here. We have trees and go back several hundred years. If you look at the Weaver River, we have about 100 years of record. To gives us a rough idea of how long droughts of Benin have severely been, but it's only 100 years record and the trees have been around for 600 or 700 or more years. How can they give us a much longer record of those droughts? Sometimes as we look in the tree rings we see droughts that are much longer, much more severe than anything we see in the historical record. We've had droughts that have lasted for more than a decade. We had one of the last for 16 years. Water managers can actually incorporate those in the forecast models to help us better prepare for droughts in future. We are excited to be able to take the information and give that water managers now, because they haven't had that for the Wasatch Front before.